The champagne flute trembled in Victoria's hand as she watched him stride through the restaurant like he owned the world. And maybe he did. At least this corner of it. The golden light from the crystal chandeliers caught the edges of his perfectly tailored suit, casting shadows that made him look less like a man and more like a force of nature. Marcus Blackwell. The name alone could move stock prices and topple governments. But tonight, in the hushed elegance of Le Bernardin, he was just another customer, or so Victoria thought. She adjusted her black uniform, smoothing down the fabric that had seen better days. 3 years of waiting tables at New York's most exclusive restaurant, and she still felt like an imposter among the marble columns and silk wallpaper. The wealthy elite who dined here spoke in whispers about mergers and acquisitions, their voices carrying the weight of decisions that could reshape entire industries. Victoria had learned to become invisible, a shadow moving between tables, collecting fragments of conversations that revealed the true cost of power. Tonight felt different. The air itself seemed charged, electric with anticipation. Marcus Blackwell hadn't made a reservation. Men like him didn't need to. They simply appeared, and the world rearranged itself around them. The maitre d' had practically genuflected when he walked through the door, leading him to the prime table by the window where the city lights painted abstract masterpieces on the glass. Victoria watched from across the dining room as he settled into his chair, his movements economical and precise. Everything about Marcus Blackwell was calculated. The way he positioned his phone just so on the white linen tablecloth. The manner in which he surveyed the room, cataloging faces and connections with the cool efficiency of a predator assessing prey. She had served men like him before, titans of industry who wore their wealth like armor, insulating themselves from the messy realities of ordinary human existence. But there was something else tonight. Something that made her pulse quicken and her instincts sharpen. Perhaps it was the way his fingers drummed against the table in a rhythm that seemed almost nervous. Or maybe it was the fact that he kept glancing toward the kitchen doors, as if expecting someone. Marcus Blackwell was waiting for something, and in Victoria's experience, when billionaires waited, the rest of the world held its breath. The restaurant hummed with its usual evening symphony. The gentle clink of silverware against fine china, the soft murmur of conversations conducted in multiple languages, the whispered instructions from the sommelier as he presented a bottle of wine that probably cost more than Victoria made in a month. But beneath it all, she sensed an undercurrent of tension like the moment before lightning strikes. Her station manager, Philippe, materialized at her elbow with the ghost-like efficiency that had made him legendary among the staff. His French accent wrapped around English words like silk around steel. Victoria, table 12. The gentleman has requested you specifically. His eyebrows arched slightly, a subtle indication that this was both unusual and significant. In 3 years, no customer had ever requested her by name. She wasn't the type of server who commanded attention. She was competent, professional, invisible, just the way she liked it. Did he say why? Victoria asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Philippe's expression remained carefully neutral. He said he appreciated discretion, and that you would understand what that meant. The words sent a chill down her spine. Discretion. In her world, that word carried weight. It meant secrets. It meant silence. It meant that whatever was about to happen, it would not be recorded in any official capacity. Victoria made her way across the dining room, weaving between tables where power brokers and socialites performed their elaborate dances of influence and manipulation. She caught fragments of conversations as she passed. A pharmaceutical heiress discussing clinical trial delays that would cost lives but save her company millions. A tech mogul laughing about the privacy violations that had made him one of the youngest billionaires in history. A defense contractor explaining how the latest international crisis would boost his quarterly projections. This was her world now, not by choice but by necessity. After her father's construction company collapsed under the weight of predatory lending practices, after her mother's medical bills had devoured what little savings remained, after the scholarship that was supposed to lift her out of poverty had been quietly revoked due to budgetary constraints, Victoria had learned that survival sometimes meant serving the very people who had destroyed everything she once held dear. She approached table 12 with the practiced smile that had become as much a part of her uniform as the starched white apron. But as she drew closer, something made her steps falter. Marcus Blackwell wasn't looking at his phone or surveying the room with his usual predatory assessment. He was staring directly at her. And in his eyes she saw something that made her blood run cold. Recognition. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwell," she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I'm Victoria. I understand you requested me specifically." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he continued to study her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, vulnerable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that could silence boardrooms and topple governments. "Victoria Chen," he said, and the way he pronounced her full name made it clear this wasn't a guess. Graduated valedictorian from Columbia with a degree in investigative journalism, daughter of Robert Chen, who owned Chen Construction until it was acquired by Meridian Holdings in a leveraged buyout that left him bankrupt and broken. Sister to David Chen, who died waiting for a heart transplant that insurance wouldn't approve. Each word hit her like a physical blow. He knew. Somehow, impossibly, he knew everything. "I'm sorry, sir, but I think you have me confused with someone else," Victoria managed, though her voice betrayed the lie. Marcus Blackwell's smile was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous. "Oh, I don't think so. You see, Victoria, I make it my business to know everything about everyone who might pose a problem for me. And you, my dear, have been a very persistent problem." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Victoria felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had once driven her to chase down corrupt politicians and expose corporate malfeasance. The same instinct that had made her one of the most promising young journalists of her generation before everything fell apart. Before she learned that the truth was a luxury she could no longer afford. "I'm just a waitress, Mr. Blackwell," she said, falling back on the mask of servility that had protected her for 3 years. But he wasn't buying it. If anything, his smile grew wider. "Are you? Because my sources tell me that a certain Victoria Chen has been asking very interesting questions about Meridian Holdings. Questions about acquisition strategies and leveraged buyouts. Questions about the mysterious deaths of whistleblowers and the convenient disappearances of key witnesses." Victoria's hand instinctively moved to the small recording device hidden in her apron pocket. The one she thought no one knew about. The one that had captured dozens of conversations over the past few months as she slowly, carefully built a case that could bring down one of the most powerful corporations in the world. But Marcus Blackwell's next words shattered any illusion of secrecy she might have clung to. "I know about the recorder, Victoria, just as I know about the safety deposit box where you've been keeping copies of everything. Just as I know about the investigative journalist at the Washington Post who's been helping you compile evidence." His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "Did you really think you could investigate me without me knowing about it?" The restaurant around them continued its elegant pantomime of civilization. But Victoria felt as though she and Marcus Blackwell existed in a bubble of tension that separated them from the rest of the world. She was trapped, exposed, caught in a web she hadn't even realized she was walking into. But something in his manner, some subtle shift in his expression, told her this conversation was far from over. "The question now," Marcus Blackwell continued, his fingers still drumming that nervous rhythm against the tablecloth, "is what we're going to do about it. You see, Victoria, I didn't ask you here tonight to threaten you. I asked you here because I need your help. The words were so unexpected, so completely contrary to everything she had anticipated, that Victoria actually took a step backward. "My help?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus Blackwell nodded, and for the first time since he'd entered the restaurant, his mask of supreme confidence seemed to slip just slightly. "Tell me, Victoria, what do you know about my daughter?" The question hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Victoria's mind raced, sifting through months of research, countless documents, and whispered conversations in shadowy corners. Marcus Blackwell had a daughter. She knew that much from the society pages and business profiles. Elena Blackwell, 22 years old, Stanford graduate, heir apparent to a financial empire worth more than most countries' GDP. But what could that possibly have to do with anything? "I know she exists," Victoria said carefully, watching his face for any tell, any crack in the facade. "I know she's being groomed to take over Blackwell Industries. Beyond that, your family keeps a remarkably low profile." It wasn't entirely true. Victoria had dug deeper than most, following paper trails and corporate filings that painted a picture of a young woman caught between expectation and rebellion. But she wasn't about to reveal the extent of her knowledge. Not yet. Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Elena disappeared 3 weeks ago. Vanished without a trace. No ransom demands, no cryptic messages, nothing. One day she was attending board meetings and charity galas. The next, she was gone." The admission seemed to cost him something. Victoria watched as the mask of invincibility slipped further, revealing glimpses of something she hadn't expected to see in a man like Marcus Blackwell. "Fear. Have you contacted the FBI? The police?" Victoria asked, though she already suspected the answer. Men like Marcus Blackwell didn't trust law enforcement with their family secrets. They had their own armies of private investigators and security consultants, people who understood that some problems required solutions that existed outside the boundaries of legal procedure. "Of course I have," he snapped, the momentary vulnerability vanishing behind a wall of irritation. "But they're treating it like a missing persons case. They think she's having some kind of quarter-life crisis. A rebellious phase. They don't understand that Elena isn't the type to run away. She's methodical, responsible, disciplined, everything I taught her to be." The last words carried a bitter edge, as if he was beginning to question whether those lessons had been the right ones. Victoria found herself leaning closer, despite every instinct screaming at her to maintain distance. This wasn't the conversation she had expected when she walked across that dining room. This wasn't the confrontation she had been preparing for during months of careful investigation. But something in Marcus Blackwell's manner, some desperate quality beneath the authoritative exterior, made her pause. "Why me?" she asked. "You have resources I could never dream of. Private investigators, security firms, government contacts. Why would you need a waitress who used to be a journalist?" The question seemed to catch him off guard, and for a moment he looked almost surprised by his own answer. "Because," he said slowly, as if working through the logic himself, "Elena mentioned you, not by name, but she described someone, a young woman working at this restaurant who asked the right questions. Someone who understood that the real story was never the one being told in public." His fingers had stopped their nervous drumming, and his hands lay flat against the white linen. "She said this person reminded her of someone she used to be, before the responsibilities and expectations became too heavy to carry." The revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow. Elena Blackwell had noticed her, had seen through the carefully constructed mask of invisibility that Victoria wore like armor. Somehow, the daughter of one of the most powerful men in the world had recognized a kindred spirit in a waitress serving champagne and caviar to people who would never see her as anything more than part of the scenery. She was investigating something, Victoria said, the pieces beginning to fall into place. Something connected to Blackwell Industries. Something that made her disappear. It wasn't a question. The look in Marcus Blackwell's eyes confirmed what she already knew. Elena hadn't vanished because of a rebellious phase or a quarter-life crisis. She had stumbled onto something dangerous, something worth killing for. Marcus nodded slowly, his face grave. She came to me 6 months ago with questions about some of our subsidiary companies. Acquisitions that didn't make financial sense, shell corporations with no apparent purpose, money moving through channels that seemed designed to obscure rather than facilitate. He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. I told her to leave it alone, that some aspects of business required a certain level of complexity to navigate regulatory requirements. I thought that would be the end of it, but it hadn't been the end. Victoria could see the story unfolding in her mind like frames of film clicking into focus. A young woman raised in privilege but gifted with a moral compass that refused to be compromised. Questions that wouldn't be silenced by paternal authority. An investigation that had led her down paths her father had hoped to keep hidden forever. She found something, Victoria said, her journalist's instincts fully awakened now. Something that threatened not just Blackwell Industries, but everything you've built. And when she tried to expose it, someone made her disappear. The accusation hung between them like a loaded weapon. Marcus Blackwell could deny it, could claim ignorance or innocence. But Victoria had learned to read the subtle language of guilt and complicity that powerful men spoke when their carefully constructed worlds began to crumble. Instead of denial, Marcus did something that surprised her. He laughed. It was a bitter, hollow sound that held no trace of humor. You think I had my own daughter killed to protect my business interests? He asked, his voice thick with something that might have been grief. Victoria, you clearly don't understand the situation you've stumbled into. I'm not the villain in this story. I'm just another victim. The words sent a chill through Victoria that had nothing to do with the restaurant's air conditioning. If Marcus Blackwell, one of the most powerful men in America, considered himself a victim, then what did that make everyone else? What forces were at work that could reduce a billionaire to seeking help from a waitress with a hidden recorder and a safety deposit box full of evidence? Then who is? She asked, though part of her already knew the answer would change everything. Marcus Blackwell looked around the dining room, his eyes cataloging faces and assessing threats with the paranoid efficiency of a man who had learned that enemies could wear the masks of friends and allies. Have you ever heard of the consortium? He asked, his voice so low that Victoria had to strain to hear him over the gentle murmur of conversation from neighboring tables. She shook her head, though something about the word sent warning signals through her nervous system. It sounded like the kind of name that existed in shadows, in whispered conversations between people who understood that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. 20 years ago, a group of individuals came together with a simple premise. Marcus continued, his words measured and careful. They believed that democracy was inefficient, that the will of the people was too chaotic and unpredictable to guide important decisions about economics, foreign policy, social development. They decided that a smaller group of enlightened individuals should be making those choices instead. Victoria felt her blood growing cold as the implications became clear. A shadow government, she whispered. Marcus nodded grimly. More than that, a shadow economy, shadow justice system, shadow everything. They don't just influence policy, they create it. They don't just manipulate markets, they are the market, and anyone who threatens to expose their existence... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Elena found evidence of the consortium, Victoria said, understanding flooding through her like ice water. She discovered that Blackwell Industries isn't just a financial empire. It's a front, a way for this group to move money and influence without anyone tracing it back to them. Marcus's silence was confirmation enough. His daughter had inherited his intelligence and his drive, but she had also inherited something he had lost long ago, a conscience that refused to be bought or silenced. She tried to come to me first, Marcus said, his voice heavy with regret. She brought me documents, recordings, financial records that showed how deep the connections went. She wanted to believe that I was ignorant of what was happening, that I had been manipulated just like everyone else. His hands clenched into fists on the tablecloth. But I couldn't give her that comfort. Because the truth is, Victoria, I've known about the consortium for 15 years. I've been their willing partner in crimes that would make your investigation into Meridian Holdings look like a parking violation. The confession hung in the air between them like a poison cloud. Victoria felt the weight of revelation settling on her shoulders, pressing down until she could barely breathe. Everything she thought she knew about Marcus Blackwell, about Blackwell Industries, about the nature of power itself had been stripped away to reveal something far more sinister underneath. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, though she was beginning to understand the answer. Marcus Blackwell wasn't confessing out of guilt or remorse. He was recruiting her, enlisting her in a war that had already claimed his daughter and would likely claim many more before it was over. "Because Elena left something behind," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket and withdrawing a small flash drive. "Something the consortium would kill to get their hands on. Something that could bring down not just me, but every member of their organization, every politician they own, every judge they've bought, every corporation they control." He placed the drive on the table between them, and Victoria stared at it as if it were a loaded gun. She hid it where she knew I would find it, but she also knew I would never have the courage to use it. She left it for someone else. Someone with the skills to understand what it contains and the integrity to do something about it. His eyes met hers across the table. "Someone like you, Victoria. Someone who has already proven they're willing to risk everything for the truth." Victoria's hand trembled as she reached for the flash drive, her fingers closing around the small piece of plastic and metal that contained enough information to reshape the world. Or get her killed. Probably both. But as she looked into Marcus Blackwell's eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected to find there. Hope. Desperate, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, his daughter's sacrifice wouldn't be in vain. The dining room around them continued its elegant charade, but Victoria knew that nothing would ever be the same. She had crossed a line tonight that couldn't be uncrossed. She held in her hand the power to expose a conspiracy that reached into every corner of American life, and she knew that from this moment forward she would be marked for death by forces that could make people disappear without leaving so much as a whisper behind. But Elena Blackwell had trusted her with this burden. A young woman she had never met who had seen something in a waitress that even Victoria herself hadn't recognized. The courage to stand up to power no matter how absolute it seemed. The determination to seek truth no matter how dangerous it might be. Victoria slipped the flash drive into her apron pocket, feeling its weight like a stone against her chest. The simple act seemed to transform the air around them, charging it with electricity and danger. She looked up to find Marcus watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Relief mixed with something that might have been pride. "There's more you need to know," he said, his voice barely audible above the restaurant's ambient noise. Elena wasn't working alone. She had help from someone inside the consortium itself. Someone who's been feeding information to selected journalists and investigators for years. Victoria's pulse quickened. A whistleblower? More than that, someone high enough in the hierarchy to have access to their most sensitive operations. Elena called them Phoenix, someone rising from the ashes of their own complicity to try to make things right. Marcus paused, glancing around the room with the practiced paranoia of a man who knew his enemies could be anywhere. Phoenix reached out to Elena 6 months ago. That's how she learned about the consortium in the first place. The revelation sent Victoria's mind spinning. If there was someone on the inside willing to expose the conspiracy, then Elena's investigation hadn't been the desperate gambit of an idealistic young woman. It had been part of a larger plan, a coordinated effort to bring down an organization that had operated in shadow for 2 decades. "How do I contact Phoenix?" Victoria asked, though she suspected the answer wouldn't be simple. Marcus shook his head slowly. "You don't. Phoenix contacts you." Elena left specific instructions on the drive about how that would work. Dead drops, coded messages, protocols that she spent months developing. His expression darkened. "But you need to understand something, Victoria. Phoenix is taking enormous risks. If the consortium discovers their identity, they won't just disappear quietly. They'll be made an example of, a warning to anyone else who might consider betraying the organization." Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She was walking into a world where power operated by rules she barely understood, where the stakes weren't just careers or reputations but lives. Yet something inside her, some spark that 3 years of serving tables hadn't quite extinguished, responded to the challenge with fierce determination. "What exactly is on this drive?" she asked, her fingers unconsciously moving to touch the small device through the fabric of her apron. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. "Everything. Financial records showing how the consortium has manipulated markets for 20 years. Communication logs revealing their influence over presidential elections, Supreme Court nominations, foreign policy decisions, video evidence of meetings where they literally divided up control of various industries like feudal lords parceling out territory." The scope of it was staggering. Victoria had spent months investigating what she thought was corporate corruption at Meridian Holdings, only to discover she had been looking at a single thread in a web that encompassed the entire power structure of American society. "Why now?" she pressed. "If this organization has been operating successfully for 20 years, what changed? Why is Phoenix willing to risk everything to expose them?" Marcus's expression grew grim. "Because they're accelerating their timeline. For 2 decades, they've been content to operate from the shadows, influencing events subtly, maintaining the illusion that democratic institutions still functioned. But something has shifted in the last year. They've become more aggressive, more direct in their interventions." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "There are rumors of something they call the Final Protocol, a plan to abandon the pretense of democratic governance entirely, to reveal themselves as the true power and eliminate any remaining opposition." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Phoenix believes they're preparing to implement it within the next 6 months." Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. The implications were too vast, too terrifying to fully comprehend. A shadow government stepping into the light, abandoning subtlety for open control. It sounded like the premise of a paranoid thriller, except she was holding evidence that it was all too real. "Elena tried to stop them," Marcus continued. "She believed that if she could expose the consortium before they implemented the Final Protocol, she could rally enough opposition to prevent it. She was wrong about one thing, though. She thought I would stand with her when the moment came." The admission hung between them like an accusation. Victoria studied his face, searching for signs of the man who had allowed his own daughter to disappear rather than risk his comfortable position within the conspiracy. What she found instead was something more complex, a mixture of grief, guilt, and what might have been genuine regret. "But you're willing to stand with me?" she asked. Marcus's laugh was bitter. "I'm a dead man walking, Victoria. The moment Elena disappeared, I became a liability to the consortium. They're keeping me alive only as long as I might be useful in locating that drive. Once they realize I've given it to you, I'll join my daughter wherever she's gone." The casual way he spoke about his own impending death sent a shiver through Victoria. This wasn't the desperate bluster of a man trying to manipulate her into helping him. This was the resigned acceptance of someone who understood that his choices had painted him into a corner with no exit. Then why? She began, but Marcus cut her off with a gesture. Because Elena was right about something. She said that power without conscience inevitably destroys itself. The consortium has grown so confident in their control that they've become careless. They believe they're untouchable. That arrogance will be their downfall, but only if someone with the skills to exploit it steps forward. Victoria felt the weight of expectation settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. She thought about her father, broken by the very forces she was now being asked to confront. About her brother, dead because insurance companies prioritized profit over human life. About all the small injustices and casual cruelties that had shaped her world, all of them suddenly revealed as symptoms of a much larger disease. "There's something else," Marcus said, his voice taking on a note of urgency. "Something Elena discovered about you specifically. It's why she knew you were the right person to carry this forward." Victoria's blood chilled. "What do you mean?" "Your father's company wasn't destroyed by random market forces or predatory lending practices. Chen Construction was specifically targeted by the consortium because your father refused to participate in a bid-rigging scheme that would have inflated costs for a series of public works projects. They made an example of him to discourage other contractors from showing similar integrity." The words hit Victoria like physical blows. Her father's destruction hadn't been collateral damage in the ruthless machinery of capitalism. It had been deliberate, calculated punishment for refusing to compromise his principles. Everything her family had suffered, everything she had endured, could be traced back to a decision made in some shadowy boardroom by people who treated human lives like chess pieces. "Your brother's death was even more direct," Marcus continued remorselessly. "The insurance company that denied coverage for his transplant? It's owned by a consortium shell corporation. They've been using healthcare rationing as a tool of social control, determining who lives and who dies based on their assessment of individual value to the system." Victoria felt rage building in her chest, a white-hot fury that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. The consortium hadn't just stolen her family's future. They had murdered her brother as surely as if they had put a gun to his head, and they had done it all from behind layers of corporate bureaucracy and regulatory complexity that made their crimes invisible to their victims. "Elena found the records," Marcus said softly. "Every decision, every denial, every calculated cruelty. She was building a comprehensive database of the consortium's victims, planning to name them all when she went public. She wanted the world to understand that this wasn't just about abstract concepts like democracy and freedom. It was about real people whose lives had been destroyed by a system designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many." Victoria closed her eyes, fighting back tears that were equal parts grief and fury. When she opened them again, Marcus was watching her with something that might have been compassion. "I know what I'm asking of you," he said. "I know what it will cost. But Elena believed that someone like you, someone who had suffered directly at the consortium's hands but retained the skills and determination to fight back, was the key to bringing them down. She died believing that. The restaurant around them continued its elegant pantomime, but Victoria felt as though she existed in a different world entirely. A world where the comfortable illusions of civilized society had been stripped away to reveal the brutal machinery of power that operated beneath the surface. She thought about Elena Blackwell, a young woman she had never met but who had somehow seen her true nature across a crowded dining room, who had recognized in a waitress the journalist she used to be, the fighter she could become again. "If I do this," Victoria said slowly, "if I take on the consortium and try to expose them, I won't be able to do it alone. Phoenix is one ally, but that won't be enough. I'll need resources, protection, people I can trust." Marcus nodded. Elena anticipated that. The drive contains not just evidence of the consortium's crimes, but also detailed intelligence on their operations. Safe houses they don't know about, communication channels they haven't compromised, allies they haven't identified. She spent 6 months building a network of people who could support someone like you if the moment ever came. Victoria felt a spark of hope kindle in her chest. Elena Blackwell hadn't just died investigating the consortium. She had died preparing for someone else to continue her work. Someone who could learn from her mistakes and avoid the traps that had ultimately claimed her life. "There's one more thing," Marcus said, his voice taking on a note of urgency. "The consortium knows you've been investigating Meridian Holdings. They've been watching you for weeks, trying to determine how much you've learned and whether you represent a threat. Tonight's meeting will be seen as confirmation that you've moved beyond casual curiosity to active opposition." Victoria felt her stomach drop. "They're watching us now?" "Almost certainly, but they won't move against you immediately. They'll want to see if you lead them to the Drive, or to Phoenix, or to any other elements of Elena's network they haven't identified. You have a window of opportunity, but it won't last long." The weight of the flash drive in her pocket seemed to increase with every word. Victoria realized that she was no longer just carrying evidence of crimes. She was carrying a target that would draw the attention of the most dangerous organization in the world. Every step she took from this moment forward would be watched, analyzed, interpreted for signs of weakness or opportunity. But alongside the fear, she felt something else, a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life for 3 years. The knowledge that she was no longer just surviving in a world that had crushed her family, but actively working to change it. Elena Blackwell had given her more than evidence of the consortium's crimes. She had given her a chance at redemption. "How do I know I can trust you?" Victoria asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Marcus smiled, and for the first time that evening it seemed genuine. "You don't," he said simply. "But Elena trusted you, and she was a better judge of character than I ever was. Besides," he added, his expression growing serious again, "I'm about to do something that will make my loyalties very clear to everyone involved." Before Victoria could ask what he meant, Marcus pulled out his phone and placed it on the table between them. With deliberate precision, he began typing a message, his fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to conducting business through electronic communication. "I'm sending a text to my consortium handler," he explained as he typed, "informing them that I've made contact with you, that I've determined you're not a threat to their operations, and that they should cease surveillance of your activities." He looked up at Victoria, his eyes hard. "This will buy you perhaps 48 hours of freedom before they realize I've lied to them. After that, you'll be on your own." Victoria stared at the phone, understanding the implications of what Marcus was doing. He was burning his bridges, sacrificing whatever protection his cooperation with the consortium had provided. It was either an elaborate deception designed to gain her trust, or it was the desperate gambit of a man trying to honor his daughter's memory in the only way he had left. Marcus hit send and placed the phone face down on the table. "There," he said quietly. "Now we're both committed." The simple act seemed to transform the nature of their relationship. They were no longer predator and prey or manipulator and victim, but reluctant allies bound together by circumstances neither had chosen. Victoria felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had once driven her to chase down stories that more cautious journalists had avoided. The thrill of standing on the edge of something vast and dangerous, with nothing but her wits and determination to keep her from falling. "What happens now?" she asked. Marcus stood up, leaving several $100 bills on the table, far more than necessary to cover a go-home and study what meal he hadn't ordered. "Now Elena left you. Learn everything you can about their weaknesses, and then you wait the consortium's structure, their methods for Phoenix to make contact." He paused at the edge of the table, looking down at her with an expression that mixed paternal concern with professional respect. "Elena believed you were strong enough for this fight, Victoria. I hope she was right, because if you're not, then we're all going to die for nothing. With that, Marcus Blackwell walked away, moving through the restaurant with the same commanding presence he had displayed when he entered. But Victoria noticed something different in his posture now, a looseness in his shoulders, as if he had finally set down a burden he had been carrying for too long. He had chosen his side in a war he had spent 20 years trying to avoid, and whatever came next, he would face it with something approaching peace. Victoria remained seated at the table, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the flash drive through her apron. Around her, the restaurant continued its timeless dance of wealth and privilege, but she was no longer part of that world. She had crossed into something darker and more dangerous, a realm where the comfortable illusions of civilized society gave way to the brutal realities of power. But she was no longer just a waitress serving champagne to people who would never see her as fully human. She was Elena Blackwell's chosen heir, the guardian of secrets that could reshape the world. And for the first time in 3 years, Victoria Chen felt truly alive. The subway car rattled through the tunnels beneath Manhattan, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across Victoria's face as she stared at her reflection in the darkened windows. The flash drive felt like it was burning a hole through her apron, though she knew the sensation was purely psychological. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that every passenger could somehow sense what she was carrying. She had taken the most circuitous route possible back to her tiny studio apartment, switching trains 3 times and doubling back twice to ensure she wasn't being followed. The skills she had developed as an investigative journalist, dormant for 3 years, were awakening like muscles remembering their strength after a long period of disuse. Every face in the crowd was a potential threat, every coincidence a possible surveillance operation. The apartment building on the Lower East Side was a testament to New York's indifference to human comfort. Peeling paint, broken mailboxes, and a stairwell that smelled of decades of accumulated desperation. But it was home, and more importantly, it was anonymous. Victoria climbed the 4 flights of stairs, her heart pounding not from exertion but from anticipation. In her purse, alongside the flash drive, she carried the key to understanding everything that had destroyed her family. Inside her apartment, Victoria moved with methodical precision. She checked the small pieces of tape she had placed on her door frame and window sills, looking for signs that someone had entered while she was gone. Everything appeared undisturbed, but she knew that meant little when dealing with professionals. She drew the curtains and activated the white noise machine she had purchased months ago, ostensibly to help her sleep, but actually to mask conversations from potential listening devices. Her laptop sat on the small kitchen table, its screen dark and waiting. Victoria had modified it herself, installing encryption software and security protocols that would make casual surveillance difficult, if not impossible. She had learned the hard way that privacy was not a right, but a privilege that had to be constantly defended against those who would strip it away for their own purposes. With trembling fingers, she inserted the flash drive into the USB port. For a moment, nothing happened, and Victoria wondered if the device had been damaged or if Marcus Blackwell had given her an elaborate fake. Then the screen flickered to life, displaying a simple interface that asked for a password. Victoria stared at the prompt, realizing she had no idea what Elena Blackwell might have chosen as her security code. She tried the obvious combinations first: Elena's birthday, her father's name, variations of Blackwell Industries. Nothing worked. Growing frustrated, Victoria leaned back in her chair and tried to think like the young woman whose investigation had cost her everything. What would matter enough to Elena Blackwell to serve as the key to her life's work? Then she remembered something Marcus had said about his daughter. She was methodical, responsible, disciplined. But she had also been investigating her own family's crimes, which suggested a moral compass that pointed toward justice rather than loyalty. Victoria typed in a single word: Phoenix. The interface dissolved, replaced by a directory structure that took Victoria's breath away. hundreds of files organized with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that marked a truly gifted investigative mind. Financial records, communication logs, surveillance footage, witness statements, organizational charts. It was a complete autopsy of American power laid bare in all its corrupt glory. Victoria opened the first file labeled simply, Overview. Elena's voice filled the small apartment through the laptop speakers, clear and determined despite the obvious stress she had been under when making the recording. If you're hearing this, then something has happened to me, and the responsibility for exposing the consortium has fallen to someone else. I pray that person is stronger than I was and smarter and more careful. The young woman's image appeared on the screen, and Victoria was struck by how much she resembled her father. The same piercing intelligence in her eyes, the same commanding presence even in a simple webcam recording. But where Marcus Blackwell projected cold authority, Elena radiated warmth and genuine compassion. She was someone who had been born into privilege but had never lost sight of her humanity. The consortium operates on a simple principle, Elena continued. They believe that democracy is chaos, that freedom is inefficiency, and that order can only be maintained through the concentrated application of power by those intelligent enough to wield it responsibly. They see themselves as the rightful rulers of humanity, and they view the rest of us as children who need to be protected from our own ignorance and destructive impulses. Victoria paused the recording and sat back in her chair, trying to process the implications. She had spent months investigating what she thought was simple corporate corruption, only to discover she had been looking at the outer edges of something far more sinister. The consortium wasn't just another shadowy cabal of wealthy individuals pursuing their own interests. They were true believers, convinced that their authoritarian vision represented humanity's best hope for survival. She resumed the recording, and Elena's voice filled the room again. The membership list you'll find in the next directory includes names you'll recognize from politics, business, media, and academia. Supreme Court justices who have never met a corporate interest they wouldn't serve. Senators who vote according to instructions they receive through encrypted channels. CEOs who coordinate their decisions through a network that exists completely outside any regulatory oversight. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Victoria had always known that wealth and power were concentrated in the hands of a relative few, but she had assumed that those elites competed with each other for dominance. The idea that they might instead be cooperating, coordinating their efforts toward a common goal, transformed her understanding of how the world actually worked. But the real revelation, Elena continued, is what they're planning for the immediate future. The final protocol isn't just about abandoning the pretense of democratic governance. It's about creating a crisis so severe that the American people will beg them to take control. They're going to manufacture a catastrophe and then present themselves as the only force capable of restoring order. Victoria felt ice water flooding her veins. She opened the file labeled Final Protocol and found herself staring at a timeline that stretched over the next 6 months. Economic collapse triggered by coordinated market manipulation. Infrastructure failures caused by sabotage disguised as terrorist attacks. Social unrest fomented through targeted disinformation campaigns. Each element designed to create a cascade of chaos that would overwhelm existing institutions and create space for the consortium to step forward as saviors. The plan was diabolical in its sophistication. Rather than seizing power through force, the consortium intended to create conditions where the American people would voluntarily surrender their freedoms in exchange for stability. It was a bloodless coup disguised as crisis management, and Victoria realized with growing horror that it was already underway. She scrolled through financial records showing massive short positions taken against key sectors of the economy. Communication logs revealing coordination between consortium members and foreign actors willing to destabilize American interests for the right price. Video footage of meetings where the timeline for implementation was discussed with the casual efficiency of corporate executives planning a product launch. Elena's recorded voice returned, now heavy with exhaustion and fear. Phoenix has been feeding me information for months, but they're trapped inside the system they're trying to expose. They can't move openly without revealing themselves, which would not only end their usefulness, but likely cost them their life. That's where you come in, whoever you are. Phoenix needs someone on the outside who can take their intelligence and turn it into action. Victoria opened the file labeled Phoenix Communications and found a series of encrypted messages that painted a picture of someone high enough in the consortium hierarchy to attend their most sensitive meetings, but tormented by guilt over their complicity in the organization's crimes. The messages revealed a person wrestling with their conscience, someone who had initially believed in the consortium's stated goals, but had become horrified by their methods. I joined them because I thought they were trying to save democracy from itself, one message read. I believed their argument that professional management was preferable to mob rule. But I've watched them manipulate elections, crash economies, and eliminate anyone who threatens their power. They're not saving civilization, they're destroying it and rebuilding it in their own image. Phoenix had been documenting everything, creating a comprehensive record of the consortium's activities while maintaining their cover as a loyal member. But their position was becoming increasingly precarious as the organization prepared to implement the final protocol. Several recent messages spoke of growing suspicion among other members, of loyalty tests and security reviews that threatened to expose Phoenix's true allegiances. Elena was supposed to be my way out, Phoenix had written in what appeared to be their final message to her. She had the credibility and resources to take everything public in a way that couldn't be ignored or suppressed. But now she's gone, and I don't know if there's anyone else who can carry this forward. The clock is running out, and if we don't act soon, there won't be anything left to save. Victoria closed the laptop and sat in the darkness of her apartment, trying to absorb everything she had learned. The flash drive contained enough evidence to expose the greatest conspiracy in American history, but it also revealed the scale of the forces arrayed against anyone who tried to use that evidence. The consortium had spent 20 years infiltrating every institution that might oppose them, creating a system where traditional channels of accountability had been compromised or eliminated entirely. But Elena Blackwell hadn't died in despair. She had died believing that someone would continue her work, someone with the skills and determination to succeed where she had failed. Victoria thought about the young woman's final message, recorded just days before her disappearance, her voice steady despite the obvious danger she faced. The consortium believes that ordinary people are sheep who need to be led by their betters, Elena had said. They think that democracy is a failed experiment and that freedom is too dangerous to be left in the hands of the masses. But they're wrong about something fundamental. They assume that their victims will remain victims forever, that the people they've crushed will never find the strength to fight back. They don't understand that oppression creates its own resistance, and that truth has a power that no amount of wealth or influence can ultimately suppress. Victoria opened her laptop again and began copying the files to multiple backup drives, encrypting each one with different passwords. She uploaded selected documents to secure cloud storage services, creating redundant copies that would survive even if something happened to her. Elena's investigation would not die with her, and it would not die with Victoria either. As she worked, Victoria felt the familiar surge of purpose that had once driven her to expose corrupt politicians and corporate malfeasance. For 3 years she had been surviving, accepting the destruction of her family as the price of living in a system designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. But Elena Blackwell had given her something more valuable than evidence. She had given her hope that the system could be changed, that the consortium's apparent invincibility was an illusion maintained through fear and resignation. The first step would be establishing contact with Phoenix. Elena's files contained detailed instructions for a dead drop system, a series of coded messages and predetermined locations where information could be exchanged without direct contact. Victoria memorized the protocols and then deleted them from her laptop, understanding that the knowledge now existed only in her mind and Phoenix's. Tomorrow she would return to her job at Le Bernardin, serving champagne and caviar to the very people who had destroyed her family. But she would no longer be invisible. She would be watching, listening, gathering intelligence about the consortium's operations from their own conversations. They had made the mistake of assuming that their victims would remain powerless forever. Victoria Chen intended to prove them wrong. She thought about her father, broken by forces he had never understood, about her brother dead because faceless bureaucrats had decided his life wasn't worth the cost of saving it, about Elena Blackwell murdered for daring to expose the truth about American power. Their sacrifices would not be meaningless if Victoria could find the strength to carry their fight forward. The flash drive sat on her kitchen table, small and unremarkable, but containing the power to reshape the world. Victoria picked it up and held it to the light, marveling that something so tiny could hold such explosive secrets. Elena Blackwell had died to give her this chance. Phoenix was risking everything to support her. The least she could do was prove worthy of their faith. Outside her window, the city continued its restless dance of ambition and desperation, unaware that the very foundations of its existence were about to be challenged. Victoria Chen, former investigative journalist turned waitress turned reluctant revolutionary, was about to step onto a battlefield where the stakes were nothing less than the soul of American democracy. And for the first time in 3 years, she felt truly ready to fight. The next morning arrived with the relentless indifference of a city that never paused for individual revelation. Victoria stood before her bathroom mirror, studying the reflection of a woman who looked the same as yesterday, but felt fundamentally transformed. The face staring back at her still bore the weariness of someone who had spent 3 years serving others. But there was something new in her eyes, a spark of determination that had been dormant for far too long. She dressed in her usual uniform, smoothing the black fabric that had become a kind of armor against the world's casual cruelties. But today the uniform felt different. It was no longer just clothing, it was camouflage. A disguise that would allow her to move through the highest circles of power while remaining invisible to those who held the strings of American democracy in their manicured hands. The subway ride to work was a study in controlled paranoia. Victoria found herself cataloging every face, every gesture, every deviation from the normal patterns of urban anonymity. The businessman reading his Wall Street Journal with unusual intensity. The woman in designer clothes who seemed to be looking at everyone except Victoria. The maintenance worker whose eyes lingered just a fraction too long on her reflection in the train window. She had learned enough about surveillance to know that professional watchers were skilled at blending into crowds. But she also knew that the consortium's resources were vast enough to deploy multiple teams if necessary. Marcus Blackwell's text message had bought her temporary breathing room. But that protection would evaporate the moment they realized he had deceived them. Le Bernardin stood like a monument to refined civilization, its elegant facade hiding the brutal realities of power that Victoria now understood operated within its walls. She entered through the staff entrance, moving through the familiar ritual of checking in and preparing for another day of serving the people who had shaped her world without her knowledge or consent. The morning briefing was routine, but Victoria found herself listening with new ears, as Philippe outlined the day's reservations and special requests. Names that had once been meaningless syllables now carried weight and significance. A pharmaceutical executive whose company had been mentioned in Elena's files, a defense contractor whose relationship with the consortium was detailed in Phoenix's communications. A media mogul whose outlets had been used to disseminate carefully crafted disinformation. They were all coming to lunch today, gathering in the elegant dining room to discuss matters that would affect millions of lives. And Victoria would be there, invisible and overlooked, carrying in her memory the knowledge of their crimes and the evidence of their conspiracy. Victoria. Philippa's voice cut through her thoughts. Table 7 has requested you specifically for their lunch service, a private party, very important clients. He handed her a reservation card, and Victoria's blood chilled as she read the names. 3 consortium members, including one whose voice she recognized from Elena's surveillance recordings. This wasn't coincidence. Someone had arranged for her to serve this particular table, and there were only 2 possible explanations. Either the consortium suspected her involvement and was testing her reactions, or Phoenix had somehow engineered the assignment to facilitate contact. Either way, Victoria understood that the next few hours would determine whether she lived to continue Elena's work or joined her in whatever fate had befallen the billionaire's idealistic daughter. She spent the remaining preparation time reviewing everything she had learned from the flash drive, memorizing names and connections until the web of corruption was as familiar as the layout of the restaurant's dining room. When the lunch service began, Victoria moved through her duties with mechanical precision, serving the usual collection of wealthy patrons while keeping one eye on table 7. They arrived precisely at noon. 3 men whose combined wealth could purchase small countries and whose collective influence reached into every branch of government. Senator William Hartwell, whose voting record perfectly aligned with consortium interests despite his public image as a populist reformer. James Morrison, CEO of a media conglomerate that shaped public opinion through careful manipulation of information. Dr. Richard Steinberg, whose pharmaceutical empire had grown rich by creating artificial scarcities of life-saving medications. Victoria Chen walked out of Le Bernardin for the last time, but she wasn't the same broken waitress who had entered 3 years ago. The flash drive in her pocket pulsed like a heartbeat, carrying the power to topple empires built on lies. Phoenix had made contact through a coded message hidden in a wine order, confirming that the fight Elena Blackwell died for was far from over. As the city lights blurred past the taxi window, Victoria smiled for the first time in years. The consortium thought they owned the world, but they had forgotten something crucial. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody bothers to see.